can lead to other crises. The result of a growing crisis can be a major defeat. The crisis in Russia is growing every day. If these crises increase even more, Russia could collapse completely. The latest crisis in Russia has revealed just how bad Putin is. After Kadyrov's move, Russian commanders and the Kremlin leadership are in a panic. The Russian army is in a very difficult situation. So, what is going on in Russia? What was Kadyrov's move? Why is this move so important?
Так, ты ползи, а ты, блядь, бегом нахуй вгоняй сюда, блядь! Угоняй его, вгоняй сюда!
Сзади потихоньку иди его!
А ты ползи, блядь, ползи!
Сколько еще двое сдалось?
Сейчас.
Давай, быстрее иди!
Вас двое осталось?
Точно двое?
Бля, пацаны, будете пиздеть?
Все, верим. А кто кричал за ВДВ?
Кто кричал за ВДВ?
Десант где?
Кто не кричал? Нету нахуй.
Все, давай, ползи.
Ползи.
Тот, кто идет, обогнал его, блядь! Быстро обогнал!
На прицел.
Шо, контент.
Все, Лёх.
Так, все, лежи там!
Лежи.
The success of the Ukrainian army on the battlefield is causing chaos in Russia. The latest crisis in Russia is the result of the success of the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian commanders are gaining a huge advantage on the battlefield by organizing special operations in strategic areas. Ukrainian commanders have recently stepped up their operations to capture Russian soldiers. In many regions, the Ukrainian army is conducting sudden operations and surrounding the Russian soldiers. Desperate Russian soldiers surrender to the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army organized one of these operations in the city of Bakhmut. Ukrainian soldiers had been preparing for this operation for a long time. Ukrainian intelligence also supported this operation. Ukrainian intelligence determined the date and the time of the operation. After receiving the order for the operation, Ukrainian soldiers began to move forward quietly. It was known that there were Chechen soldiers in a boarding house in Bakhmut. Ukrainian soldiers surrounded this hostel and called on the Chechen soldiers to surrender. The Chechen soldiers realized that they were cornered. If the fighting started, victory was impossible. Chechen soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian army. They were taken to Kiev and interrogated. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian government has launched a special study. As you know, in all wars, prisoners are exchanged between the parties.
Еще раз, Путин. Молодцы вообще. Слава Украине!
Героям слава!
О, героям слава, кто сказал? Красавчик, блядь. Вы что, еще не выучили, блядь?
So, the Ukrainian government started negotiations with Russia to exchange prisoners again. As a result of these negotiations, a new prisoner exchange agreement was concluded between the two countries. As a result of this agreement, Chechen soldiers were sent to Russia. But this is when the crisis started. The Ukrainian government sent Chechen soldiers to Grozny airport. The Chechen soldiers thought that they would be welcomed back home as war veterans. All prisoners of war are considered heroes and are given the title of veteran. But for the Chechen soldiers, it was different. No government officials came to the airport to welcome them. Except for some mid-level local officials and the families of the soldiers, no one paid any attention to them. This strange situation surprised everyone. The Chechen soldiers were very disappointed. This incident soon became the talk of Russia. The Russian press started criticizing Kadyrov for not welcoming the soldiers. After the criticism increased, Kadyrov made a statement on the issue. However, after the statement, all hell broke loose. Kadyrov wrote in a telegram that a Chechen fighter must prove that he has no choice but to be captured. Kadyrov was extremely angry at the Chechen soldiers who surrendered. Kadyrov continued to make statements on this issue. You need to prove that you are not running away from the war by returning to the front, he said. He said Chechen soldiers who had just returned from the war zone and were reunited with their families after a long time should rejoin the army as soon as possible. Kadyrov emphasized that it was a matter of honor. As a result of Chechen leader Kadyrov's statements, everyone in Russia was stunned, but Chechen soldiers were the most surprised. Chechen soldiers felt that they were not trusted. One Chechen soldier then told the Russian press about his experiences. The Chechen soldier said they had no chance in the fighting in this area. He said that Ukrainian soldiers organized a very successful operation. The heavy defeat of the Russian army on the front line has become a hot topic in Russia. Russian people became more aware of the bad situation in the war. The soldiers' statement angered Putin. Russian leader Putin decided to meet with Chechen leader Kadyrov on this issue. However, Kadyrov was very harsh with him. Kadyrov made another statement on this issue. In his statement, he implied that Chechen soldiers were being oppressed by the Russian army. Kadyrov emphasized that Chechen soldiers reported that they ran out of ammunition before they were captured, but Russian commanders failed to solve this problem. Kadyrov also said that Russian commanders did not give Chechen soldiers enough ammunition. According to Kadyrov, Chechen soldiers have been warned to use their ammunition very sparingly. Following Kadyrov's statements, minorities living in Russia have been outraged against Putin's government. Many allegations of mistreatment of soldiers by Russian commanders began to spread. As a result of the increasing tension in the country, a crisis broke out in the Russian army. Chechen soldiers started to rebel against the orders of Russian commanders. The hierarchical structure within the Russian army is breaking down. Russian commanders cannot maintain order within the army. It is said that Chechen soldiers are very likely to start a revolt against Russian commanders. The Kremlin leadership is holding emergency meetings to resolve this crisis, but none of these meetings are working. Kadyrov's story has caused great tension in Russia. Especially Chechens are very angry against Russia. On the other hand, demands for independence are growing in the countries that are part of the Russian Federation. Especially, young people in these countries now want to be independent from Russia. According to research in Russia, most of the soldiers joining the Russian army are from minorities. Putin is sending poor youth from minority regions to war. After this situation was revealed, anti-Putin sentiments started to spread in minority regions. Especially, the Chechen people now want to be an independent country from Russia. Putin is worried about the growing demands for independence in Russia. He wants to solve this problem, but for that, he needs the support of minority representatives. Meanwhile, the crisis in the Russian army is growing rapidly. The Russian press is reporting dozens of reports of fights between soldiers. There have been many fights in the Russian army since the beginning of the war. However, it is known that fights have increased more recently. These fights are causing the Russian army's success on the battlefield to decline. The Russian army is suffering a heavy defeat. Kadyrov's statements are causing more problems in the Russian army. Kadyrov's statements could completely change the political balance in Russia.